colleges exist. I mean, in a few years, we're going to be paying thousands and thousands of dollars to the educational system and basically selling our souls to pay it off in the future. And obviously we all know about school shootings, what with the media and the news broadcasters, and how everything's completely blown up nowadays. And we've also all heard of Ohio, a state that has nothing except for Cedar Point. Now, one of the most high-profile school shootings ever was actually in Ohio, which is strange because, as I said, Ohio has nothing. It was called the Kent State shootings. In the 1960s, we were at war with North Vietnam. We were trying to keep our policy of containment, and we were trying to contain the communism. And in 1970, Nixon decided, hey, let's invade Cambodia. A completely unnecessary move on his part, but he was just scared that communism would once again spread. So, the very next day, protests, rallies, everyone was against this. Everyone, including the students at Kent State. Now, the rallies got kind of violent, and when I say kind of, I mean very violent. On May 4th, the National Guard fired.
So, before we talk about the actual shootings, we have to get a little bit of background information. April 30th, 1970. This was the day that Nixon announced the impending invasion of Cambodia, although they've already been within the borders of Cambodia, and they'd been bombing weeks prior to the formal declaration of invasion. And this event was sort of the catalyst, I guess one could say. It was the catalyst that caused the Kent State shootings, the Jackson State shootings, and just a bunch of protests throughout the country. Nobody thought this invasion was a good idea except for Nixon, honestly. The Kent State shooting stretched from May 1st to May 4th, but the declaration of invasion the day prior is what actually caused the rallies and protests to happen. Now, a lot of people wanted to protest Nixon's idea, so at Kent State, they decided we're having a demonstration at noon. So at this demonstration, they planned a rally for May 4th, the following Monday, and they actually buried a copy of the Constitution. And that fact was probably my favorite fact researching the entire topic. I thought it was really cool that they did that. And after the demonstration, there was a lot of conflict that evening between police and protesters in the city because they were still pumped up from the demonstration and there were a lot of bitter feelings, and this resulted in a lot of vandalism on the protesters' end. Bars were closed by local authorities, and hundreds of people were pushed towards the campus with tear gas from the police. And eventually they did disperse, and the Kent mayor declared a state of emergency, and he even called the governor of the state for assistance from the National Guard. And that's pretty much what happened on May 1st. It wasn't the main point of the shootings. Obviously, no one was shot. However, it was a very, very violent beginning to an even more violent end. So, May 1st was kind of the beginning to the Kent State tragedies, but May 2nd also had some very prominent things that happened as well. On May 2nd, there were rumors regarding radical activities throughout the town and the campus, and university officials acquired an injunction prohibiting the damage to campus property, meaning anyone who damaged or vandalized anything on campus property was going to get in a lot of trouble, because now it's prohibited, which you'd think it would already be prohibited, but I guess not. And then, this is a picture of the burned ROTC building. That evening, over 1,000 protesters surrounded this building and burned it to the ground. And then protesters interfered with firemen trying to put out the fire as fire hoses were punctured and rocks were thrown, etc. They just didn't want it to be put out. The National Guard arrived on campus and used tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the crowd after they burned it down. So the National Guard was a little late to the party, but hey, whatever. So, Sunday, May 3rd was actually relatively calm compared to the 2 days prior to it. They actually had a carnival. Sunday morning, Governor Rhodes issued a statement that would seek a court order declaring a state of emergency. and he never actually sought out that court order, but if he would have, it would have given control of Kent State to the National Guard under martial law, which they occupied it without the state of emergency, so I don't really understand how that could have happened, but they did. So in the early evening, a crowd gathered around the Victory Bell, and when they would not disperse, the riot act was read and tear gas was used by the National Guard, and the Guard was occupying the campus at this time. So demonstrators regrouped and they blocked traffic on a busy intersection. When the crowd was said to have grown hostile, the National Guard read the riot act again, and they used more tear gas, and both sides of the opposition were injured, and this caused some tension, and that made protesters more ready for the rally tomorrow because they really wanted to get their point across then. May 4th. This was the day where the actual shootings happened, and it's kind of infamous when you think about it. At noon, people gathered in the Commons, and this was their rally they had planned since May 1st. The National Guard's order to disperse was met by rock throwing and cursing and opposition from the protesters. The National Guard fired tear gas, and it backfired because the wind was blowing at the National Guard, so then the tear gas was thrown back on them. Yeah. The Guard proceeded towards the crowd, and they had fixed bayonets on their guns, and it forced protesters to withdraw to an athletic field on campus. The guards became boxed in because 3 sides of the athletic field had fences, and then the protesters were coming at them from the other side. So more physical and verbal assaults were exchanged between the two, and after approximately 10 minutes, the guards returned to the top of Blanket Hill with some ambitious and angry demonstrators following. The Guard turned, and 28 guardsmen fired between 61 and 67 shots in 13 seconds. And it killed 4 students, these being the 4 students, and wounded 9 others. These are the infamous Kent State shootings that happened, and it's still unclear whether or not they were given an order to fire, or whether someone misfired and then everyone else just began firing, or whether they just fired out of anger. It's kind of unclear, and many people still debate that to this day. So I've mentioned the Jackson State shootings a few times. These happened 11 days after the Kent State shootings on May 15th, and these killed 2 and injured 12. And the Kent State shootings were the first example of campus unrest following Nixon's formal declaration of invasion, but many others did happen, and Jackson State is a good example. People protested this invasion like it was nobody's business. Many people were against Nixon's impending invasion just because of these people that were getting killed. That's a death total of 6 just from college universities happening within a 20-day span of each other. And even some magazines like Life picked up what happened. And people protested. I mean, it was a horrible thing that happened. So what's another instance when soldiers were just firing into a crowd when things got hectic and then it resulted in the loss of lives? The answer? The Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre was almost exactly like the Kent State shootings, except the circumstances that led to it were different. Soldiers, angry crowd throwing rocks, crowd yelling insults, tension between the two sides, the soldiers firing, the loss of lives of protesters or an angry crowd. They're the same thing, except in the Boston Massacre, they actually put people on trial. The soldiers, in fact, one of them was charged with murder, and the guardsmen weren't even tried in the Kent State shootings. I just find that a little strange. Well, those were the Kent State shootings. I hope I answered all of your questions, and adios.